This is how a brutal attack on a ship takes place. Very soon, a brutal battle ensues. Jews who tried to escape from the Soviet Union were called by the same name, pirates. Was it in fact their aim to take hostages and to pillage? It would be more correct to call their action fleeing from the prison. The Soviet Union was a huge place of imprisonment. Mankind must remember the significance of the deed accomplished by a handful of Jews in the Soviet Union. It constituted a challenge to the whole of this huge totalitarian regime. What was the source of the courage of the Jews of the Soviet Union? After all, were not all Jews the most downtrodden people in the state? What impelled them to undertake such a daring step? The answer is clear. The very existence of, indeed now, the Jews have a state of their very own, the State of Israel. The existence of the Jewish state was a source of courage and readiness for self-sacrifice, and a direct reflection of the heroism shown by the Jewish people when fighting daily for its independence. And now, let's go back to the origins, to those with whom it all began. The aspiration of Russian Jews to Eretz Yisrael is an ancient one. The Zionist movement, or more correctly, the movement to create a Jewish state, arose in the Russian Empire before Theodor Herzl even envisioned it. We're talking about movements such as Bilu and Chovevei Tzion. Until close to the Bolshevik Revolution, there numbered in the Russian Empire some 300,000 paying members of the Jewish National Fund, which dealt with purchasing land in Eretz Yisrael. The blue box of the JNF Fund was known to every Jew there. Under the communist regime, the Zionist movement was cruelly persecuted, and its members went underground. Hundreds and thousands were arrested and imprisoned in prisons and concentration camps, or were expelled to distant parts. Only a few of them, after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, managed to immigrate to Israel. The majority who remained did not give in to the efforts of the Soviets to resolve the Jewish problem through assimilation and intermarriage. The victory over Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and the establishment of the State of Israel led to a renewed awakening of the love of Zion. In response to the national awakening, the tyrant Stalin threw people into concentration camps for being guilty of betrayal of the motherland and nationalism. One of the prisoners of Zion, or Asirei Tzion at that time, Michael Batalsky, wrote in his songs in his place of imprisonment, "We could have conceded defeat and death had we begged on our knees, and we would have been pardoned. But we have pride. We will not assimilate, not give in to anyone, and for this merit we remain alive."
Еврейское национальное движение, сионистское движение в Советском Союзе никогда не прерывалось полностью.
The National Jewish Movement in the Soviet Union never ceased to exist completely, although at the start of the 1930s, the organized Zionist activity was utterly liquidated. And yet people with a Zionist outlook remained, even in the Stalin lockups.
Произошло некоторое, смягчение обстановки, то, что называют хрущевской оттепелью.
At the time of the thawing of the oppressive situation towards the end of the 1950s, in the days of Khrushchev, those people who had survived the forced labor camps of Stalin awoke to some sort of activity, some in the area close to them, in the family, or with close friends.
In the 1950s, there appeared a new generation of Asirei Tzion, prisoners of Zion. This happened at the end of the Second World War, after the coming of the Holocaust, but especially after the establishment of the State of Israel. One of the directions of the activity was gathering the Jewish youth in order to restore places of mass massacre during the Holocaust. Participating in this undertaking were those who had lived in the vicinity of the Minsk ghetto, in Babi Yar, in Kiev, in the Ramboli forest on the outskirts of Riga, and in other places. An additional direction of activity was the establishment of study groups for the study of the language of our people, the Hebrew language. As a result of this, there sprang up a network of Zionist organizations in different cities, in Moscow, Kiev, Kharkov, Minsk, and even in distant places like Sverdlovsk and Frunz. In Leningrad, there sprung up several Hebrew study groups organized by the Zionist Committee.
Организация приняла на себя задачи. Это основная задача – борьба за свободный выезд евреев.
The organization took upon itself a number of tasks. The main one, the struggle for freedom to go to Israel. In this framework, they had to fight against assimilation. As for a most meaningful area of activity which the organization was involved in, this was the establishment of the ulpans. Here with us in Leningrad, a number of ulpans were established with their principals and teachers. Among those who participated in this most actively
были учителя и руководители этих ульпанов, очень активно в этом участвовал.
Were Hillel Butman, Vladimir Mohilever, David Chernoglaz, Asher Blank, and they even taught songs in Hebrew.
Наиболее такие яркие дела делались в организации, которые были совершенно...
There were varied projects. The organization established a center for publishing the material, and we assembled an ARA photography machine.
And then the Six-Day War broke out. In the Soviet Union, there began in quite unprecedented manner the return to a Jewish identity. There was a significant upsurge of Zionist activity. Young Jews felt themselves to be part of the IDF, fighting in enemy country. Spiritually, they already saw themselves as being in Israel. The aspiration to get to the state of Israel grew amazingly.
Мы подали документы, это было в 1969 году. И в 1969 году, через какое-то время, получили категорический отказ.
We submitted an application for permission to leave in 1969. Very soon we received an absolute refusal to our request. The refusal was given verbally without presenting a document. I was summoned to the permits department. I was told that I had absolutely no need to immigrate to Israel. In the Soviet Union, we were all well off, studying, working. In short, we had to remain where we were. I asked about the possibility of appealing the decision. I received the answer, no, this is an absolute refusal without any possibility to complain. We do not recommend contacting us further. No point.
At the same time, there was taking place the unification of groups scattered throughout the Soviet Union. A central coordinating committee was set up, VKK. The growth of the Zionist movement, which organized groups studying Hebrew, Jewish history, and tradition under the nose of the KGB, was an incomparable success. The coordinating committee published an organ of the movement called Iton, the newspaper. Representatives from Moscow, Leningrad, and Riga collaborated on the editorial committee of the publication. Yosef Mendelevich from Riga engaged in the production of the newspaper. The first meeting of the editorial board of the Iton took place in Leningrad in the apartment of Esther Winger. During the preparation of the newspaper, Mendelevich met with Viktor Boguslavsky and Leib Kornbluth.
We strategized about the editorial content regarding the sections that needed to be included. I showed them the articles that I prepared. The content for the first edition of the newspaper was ready. Viktor Boguslavsky contributed a lot of the material for the paper. I immediately began to prepare the newspaper for publication.
Then there occurred an astonishing development. An ex-Soviet pilot, Major Mark Dimshitz, joined the Hebrew study group in one of the ulpans in Leningrad. Dimshitz identified with the State of Israel even before the Six-Day War, when Egypt and Syria were about to destroy the Jewish state.
Никто не поддерживал Израиль. Такое впечатление, что над страной нависла угроза.
Nobody supported Israel. The impression was that the state was facing the threat of destruction. I was very worried. The Soviet media spoke in a hostile tone. The Soviet propaganda, in fact, engaged in a fierce attack on the state of Israel. In fact, anti-Semitic preaching.
Я собирал все статьи, опубликованные в журналах и в газетах, причем на суде в дальнейшем все вот эти вырезки из газет, журналов.
I collected articles of the type published in their newspaper and publications. It seemed to me that all of the material which I collected served as counter-evidence in the court.
И вот тогда у меня возникло уже первое.
In those days, there grew in me the thought that I did not at all wish to remain in the Soviet Union.
In order to get to Israel, Dimshitz suggested to Hillel Butman, an Ulpan teacher and member of the committee in Leningrad, a plan to hijack a Soviet plane.
I met with Butman several times. I recall that on the third meeting I shared with him the dream to leave the Soviet Union and to get to Israel. Afterwards, we began to discuss all the ways to achieve this. Finally, we came to the conclusion that the realistic way was to hijack the plane.
Butman enriched the plan with the idea to hold a press conference at the place where the hijacked plane landed. In the press conference, they would have to appeal to the Jews of the world to support the struggle for freedom of emigration from the Soviet Union.
Had it been possible to leave the Soviet Union then, I would have left immediately, even before the Six-Day War, because this was impossible. I had to search for every possible way. I was full of ideas.
The ideas developed into a plan to hijack the new Soviet plane, the Tu-124, with a capacity of over 60 passengers.
Мы с ним обсуждали вопрос, что делать, и пришли к выводу, что я, значит, беру на себя задачу познакомиться с самолетом.
I discussed with Butman about what we could do. We came to the conclusion that I had to learn about the TAV Tu-124 airplane, which flew onto Leningrad-Murmansk route. Butman undertook to recruit passengers.
В общем, под названием «Свадьба».
We gave this the name, wedding. The proposed groom was Mikhail Kornblut.
Невеста я уже не помню, как ее звали.
The name of the bride, I do not recall. We had to recruit some 60 people to participate in the operation.
Hillel Butman started in Leningrad to recruit participants in the hijacking from among the members of the Zionist movement in the underground. By doing so, he bypassed the Central Committee in Leningrad, the Komitet. Butman was well aware that the Komitet would oppose the hijacking operation. In order to recruit additional members, Butman returned to Riga. Butman knew that in Riga the Zionist movement was extremely powerful.
Я к тому времени уже втянул в операцию свадьбу Кузнецова и Сильву.
At that time, I recruited for Operation Wedding Edward Kuznetsov and Silva Zalmanson. I asked them to recruit about another 10 participants from among the Jews of Riga. In Leningrad, I had already found some 40 people prepared to run the risk. Kuznetsov had not long been released from prison and was living near Moscow. He had come to Riga not long ago and did not know anyone with a Zionist outlook, except for his friends, opponents of the regime. And so Mendelevich engaged in looking for volunteers.
В основном вот Менделевич занимался подбором этих вербовкой.
I started recruiting. No, not recruitment. That is, among others, I would call it joining friends.
Нас привлечение твоих товарищей по духу.
In Riga, there lived Aaron Spielberg, who not long ago had moved here from Leningrad. He introduced Butman to Silva Zalmanson, a friend of his wife. Silva was engaged in printing material for the underground newspaper of the movement, edited by Yosef Mendelevich. And why was this improvisation of issuing a newspaper necessary? Quite simply, because the Soviet press was both anti-Semitic and anti-Israel in their approach. It was at this time that Silva Zalmanson was registered for marriage to Edward Kuznetsov, who had recently been released from prison after having been sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for anti-Soviet activity. Kuznetsov had moved to Riga because at that time several Asirei Tzion had received emigration permits there. He guessed that if he remained in the Soviet Union and continued with his activity, the KGB would rearrest him. Silva Zalmanson knew that Yosef Mendelevich, the editor of the underground newspaper Iton, was connected with the members of the underground movement. She asked Kuznetsov to talk with Mendelevich about this.
I felt that some dramatic, perhaps even tragic act was necessary which would compel the Soviets to retreat from their totally closed gates policy.
The moment that Mendelevich heard from Kuznetsov about Butman's and Dimshitz's plan, he joined the group without hesitation. In his diary, Kuznetsov recalls that he was surprised by Yosef's immediate agreement. He was unaware of the ardor of the Zionist underground activists and had not anticipated an immediate positive response. In fact, Hillel Butman did not act carefully in recruiting the participants. In order to attract the number of participants required for the operation, he contacted people whom he barely knew. According to Mark Dimschitz, out of the total of those approached, only about 25% agreed to participate in the operation. Sometime later, members of the Zionist Committee of Leningrad learned about Butman's unsolicited initiative. He was given a sharp rebuke for this independent activity. It was a justified reaction. The committee members undertook not to undertake independent activity. The committee's declared goal was strengthening and spreading Zionism and Jewish education. However, this limited educational activity did not have the capacity to prevent the assimilation prevalent among the 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union. The Zionist Committee in Leningrad managed to convey to Israel information concerning Butman's plan to the relevant elements in the State of Israel. From there arrived an absolute prohibition with regard to continued preparations to hijack a Soviet plane. Mendelevich and Kuznetsov decided that they were interested in continuing to proceed with the planning of the operation, and therefore they got in touch with Mark Dimschitz directly. Kuznetsov writes in his book that he felt it was better not to hurry with pursuing the operations, but some mystical power was propelling him forward. This power was the unbridled enthusiasm and ardor of the Zionist youth in Riga. Dimschitz traveled to Riga and met with Mendelevich and Kuznetsov. The meeting with them persuaded him that he could rely on them. Incidentally, the Jews were not the first to attempt to hijack a plane and escape from the Soviet Union, but all the attempts had been in vain. Anyone who attempted it was given extensive terms of imprisonment. Mark Dimschitz returned to Leningrad and began searching for solutions for the hijacking by a limited group of Jews from Riga. He was successful, and he informed Riga that he had something that was ideally suited for the plan. It did not occur to him to what extent that what he said was in fact prophetic.
Я неоднократно ездил на
I would frequently visit the Smolny airfield. I watched the landing and takeoff of the planes in order to refresh my experience as a pilot. In our flight department, they used to say, to watch a plane landing 10 times is as if you were landing yourself. In short, I went there to study things at close hand. Suddenly, on June 1st, 1970, I saw an advert about a new flight route that had opened to Priozorsk.
В аэропорту я увидел объявление, что вводится новый рейс на Приозерск.
He thought about taking the group aboard a plane flying to the town of Priozersk. From there, the plane was due to continue on to Sortovalo, a town situated about 50 kilometers from the border with Finland. The truth is that its proximity to the border was not a real advantage. There was an agreement forced on Finland to extradite anyone escaping from the Soviet Union. Anyone doing so from the standpoint of the Soviet Union was a criminal seeking to avoid punishment. Finland sent back people without any examination. Consequently, to get political asylum in Finland was an impossibility. Therefore, the plane, after it was hijacked, would have to fly over Finland and the Baltic Sea and land in Sweden. There was barely enough fuel in the plane for such a lengthy flight. The experienced Mark Dimschitz carefully selected the nearest landing point. According to his calculations, the port city of Boden was the optimally best point for landing. Major Dimshitz also planned additional means in order to mislead the Russian air defense system. According to the plan, he was supposed to fly at the lowest height above the treetop in the most forested area. The radar systems were not able to trace a plane flying at such a low level. In addition, Dimshitz intended to make out as if he was the Soviet pilot struggling with the hijackers. He was supposed to report to the Air Force watchtowers that he was in control of the situation, would land the plane in Finland. All this was designed to protect us from the Soviet anti-aircraft guns. In actual fact, he intended to land on an international highway in Finland and immediately take off again. In this way, the Soviet air defense would lose track of the escaped plane. Any plane taking off from Finnish soil could have been a Finnish plane as well. Mark Dimshitz set the date for the hijacking for June 15, 1970, which was the date for the Supreme Soviet election in the Soviet Union. From his experience as a member of the Soviet Air Force, he knew that on such days the pilots were drunk on vodka and the air defense was non-existent. They decided to arrive in Leningrad in small groups of participants. A few days before the operation, the sister of Yosef Mendelevich, Marie, married his friend Aryeh Hanoch. Butman's plan to present the large company that was due to board the plane as flying to the wedding had already been cancelled. But here indeed were a real bride and groom, Aryeh and Marie. Marie was pregnant. The plan was for Marie and Aryeh to wait beside a landing strip near Priozhsk and board the plane only after the hijacking. Aryeh and Marie were joined by Silva Zalmanson and Boris Penson. In Riga, there remained only a few participants. The atmosphere was very nervous. Dimshitz knew from work experience with civil aviation in Kazakhstan, on the border with Iran, that pilots flying close to the border were equipped with pistols. In order to be accepted for work, they had to declare that they would shoot at anyone attempting to escape across the border. It is instructive that the participants in the operation never once discussed the prospects of success of the operation. When Mendelevich, in a conversation with Israel Zalmanson, the brother of Silva, commented that the chance of success was very low, perhaps not more than 20%, Israel felt very uneasy. But Kuznetsov calmed his young brother-in-law and said that there was every chance of success. Before Kuznetsov, too, was due to leave Riga for Leningrad, he told him surprisingly that the Leningrad people had asked him to blur the Jewish character of the operation. Therefore, he had added on his own initiative two of his prison friends, Fedorov and Muzhenko. Yosef Mendelevich was very upset by Kuznetsov's word. How had he taken such a decision without consulting the other members? After all, the whole significance of the operation was in effect to emphasize the national aim. In fact, this fear was well-founded. Here is what Meir Vilner, the Secretary General of the Communist Party in Israel, said.
All the claims that these people were put on trial only because they were Jews is nothing more than deceit. Take, for example, the fact that among the initiators there were Russians. Therefore, all the talk that the people who were put on trial because they wanted to emigrate to Israel is absolute falsehood. Anti-social slander concerning the situation of the Jews will always remain a part of the Cold War against Soviet Union.
What to do? How to save the situation? Yosef Mendelevich decided that he would write a declaration which would unequivocally assert the aim of the operation, a powerful appeal for the freedom of emigration from the Soviet Union. We 9 Jews who live in the Soviet Union are trying to leave without seeking permission from the authorities. With us are tens of thousands of Jews who, in the course of many years, as the authorities are aware, desire to leave the state and immigrate to Israel. Despite all of our requests, the authorities have rejected our appeals and refused to acknowledge our right to leave the state. Every attempt by the state to resolve the Jewish problem has met with failure. They need to realize that we shall not remain silent. It is not for them to determine our fate. By this action, we wish to indicate to the Soviet authorities the veracity of these facts. We wish to explain to the Soviet authorities that it is in their best interest to permit us to return to our homeland. The main motivation of our action being the fierce desire to live in our own land and to live the life of the Jewish people. Mendelevich wrote in sequence without revision, and at once brought it to Kuznetsov to make him identify with these principles. He signed without any hesitation, only adding a few comments regarding the freedom of the citizens in the Soviet Union. Most of the participants had already left, and Mendelevich signed instead. Later, in a court session, Mendelevich's lawyer would say,
Их судили за измену родине.
They sentenced them for betraying the motherland. Whenever I would issue an appeal or appear in court, I maintained that Yosef Mendelevich had 3 times submitted a request to leave. Now they are describing his actions as betraying the motherland. Does this signify that prior to this he had already officially stated his wish to betray the motherland? You really have been mistaken to use such a stupid expression.
The last group left Riga on Friday. They were the brothers Wolf and Israel Zalmanson, along with Yosef Mendelevich. Wolf was still serving in the Soviet army and wore the army uniform of a lieutenant. Mendelevich borrowed from Silva Zalmanson 5 rubles. He was unemployed and had no money. With this money, he bought half a kilo of chocolate and rusks. In central Leningrad, Anatoly Altman awaited them. He told them that the friends of Kuznetsov, Fedorov, and Muzhenko had already arrived. According to them, they felt that they were being watched, but they had managed to get away. We took a taxi in one direction. We stopped the taxi and ran to the opposite direction, and again took another taxi. We disengaged. Altman told the members of the second group, Mari Mendelevich, her husband Aryeh, Boris Pinson, and Silva, were rather nervous. They felt that the KGB was tracking them. Kuznetsov tried to calm Silva. And yet the feeling did not mislead them. They were all arrested in Priyozhersk. In a Zoom conference, Hanoch told,
Прошло какое-то время, может быть, еще полчаса. Пришел ко мне еще, вышел один человек.
Some time passed, perhaps half an hour. Someone else appeared and came in my direction. He asked me, "May I light a cigarette from the bonfire?" "Okay." And I answered, "That's fine." I understood that then would be an arrest. The man drew a gun and shouted, "Raise your hands!" I raised my hands. I heard a shot. He had aimed at me. He ordered us to lie on the ground.
И сзади я одели мне наручники, я увидел, что всех остальных моих друзей тоже одевают наручники, и нас рассадили в разные машины и повезли.
Other people arrived and started to handcuff us. They put us into cars and began to drive off. On the way, I felt that my eyes were watering. I was amazed at myself that I was calm. I had been ready for them to arrest us. The man who had shot at me said, "The tears will stop." I understood that he had shot at me with tear gas.
Their arrest was dramatic. Not surprising that already in the first interrogations, a number of those arrested began to reveal details of the operation. Meanwhile, Mendelevich, the Zalmanson brothers, and Anatoly Altman traveled to a meeting of all the participants in a wood not far from the Smolny airfield, where they were due to take off the following day. In the wood, where the get-together took place, there was a joyful atmosphere. They joked, cooked over a bonfire, tourists to all intents and purposes. Sometime later from Leningrad, there appeared Mark Dimshitz to deliver a final briefing and to divide them into task groups. Dimshitz had an improvised gun from the time he worked in a factory.
But anyway, it was a very regular, romantic situation. And then all of a sudden, discussing our roles in taking over, we noticed that several cars, black cars, come close to our place. It was a known type of Volga, widespread Russian cars, but this type of cars, black, with the numbers 00 and something, certainly were of secret services. Some plainclothes people walked out from the cars, walking to our direction. So we felt tensed, we felt that something is happening, and we expected to be arrested. For also there were only maybe some couple of people, 3, 4 of them, but who know, maybe much more would come from our back. Anyway, the people come close. I would say some maybe 10 meters, 15 meters close to us, and all of a sudden they turned around and went away, took their cars and went away. But anyway, people felt that something is happening, and some friends discussed it and suggested that we have to run away. And they told it's obvious that we are being found by secret services. They know about us everything. They are going to arrest us. Let us escape. I told, in no way. I told, see, if they really know about our scheme, they will arrest us anyway. But if we escape, it will be a failure. Let's go up to the end. I meant a real end, whatever happened in the airport, but just to be arrested on the way to Eretz Israel. To be arrested in the airport meant to start our way, our escape. And Mr. Dimshit certainly supported my approach, and it was a decision. Whatever will happen, we will go and try to board the airplane. So it was night, we went to sleep. It was not an easy sleep. I slept on the ground, for I was tensed. I was ready to make my task. In the morning, we stood up and went to the airport. It means the forest was very close to the airport, like maybe some 15 minutes by foot. I was very excited. I thought to myself, what this privilege to bring freedom to Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, it's my part, I will do it, you know. I couldn't believe that I, a simple man, can be part of this outstanding effort. So I feel that everybody felt like that. I don't know. Some people ask me, was I afraid? In a way, I was not afraid. I just thought of the privilege of doing that. Fyodor and Murzenko went to the railway station to see whether Dimshit and Kuznetsov are being followed by KGB agents, and then coming back, they waved with a hand that everything is okay, they are being not followed by KGB. After we decided that we shall continue anyway, also we felt that we are being watched by secret services. Before going to sleep, I suggested, friends, whatever you have, like notes or some addresses of other people, try to eliminate that if being really arrested, nothing will be left. Some of them went in the forest, but after we were arrested, it turned out that simply torn their notebooks in a couple of pieces and throw it in a lake. So the next day, KGB people came, took out from the lake their notes, and people were searched, and some of them arrested.
На промежуточном аэродроме, где еще можно было появиться без соответствующего разрешения погранслужбы,
At the place where the plane made a landing, according to the official route, we were supposed to catch the pilots and tie them up whilst making sure that they were okay. We had agreed not to use force in order not to cause any harm.
Было запрещено проводить какие-то насильственные действия с тем, чтобы их не ранить.
The intention was to remove them from the plane and to place them in sleeping bags in the tent in order to protect them from rain. After this, we would bring aboard the plane 4 members who were waiting in the woods.
And then it was announced boarding. Friends started walking by foot, for it was a local airport, a very small one. So I was I was the last one in the row. I looked to my friends stepping to the airport. I felt proud. Really, as a military task force, strong young men with backsets on their backs. I felt like I'm already part of IDF. And then some of them start looking at my direction. What would they look for? So I imagined that maybe they told me that I had a black beret. As a religious man, I covered my head. And before leaving the forest, they told me, remove the beret. Now they're looking to my beret in this very outstanding situation. And then I understood it's not that, you know. They're looking not at me, just in my back. So I looked myself as well, and I understood what the problem. Mr. Demchit was missing. What happened, you know? I noticed him coming at the airport with his wife and 2 small daughters. So I figured maybe they didn't listen to the announcement, for they were outside the building of the airport, a smaller, shabby building. Anyway, they stayed outside, so maybe they didn't listen to the announcement. I have to tell them. I start running back. You know, some people standing in a gate of the airport try to prevent me to run, but I assume they couldn't imagine that this young student with glasses is a hijacker. So they finally permit me to go. I ran up to the place that I met. I saw Mr. Dimshitz coming with his family, and indeed they were there. I became angry. I told Mark, what you are doing here? He sat with his family. It was early in the morning. They had some breakfast, some sandwiches. Stop your sandwiches. We are going to board. We are going to save our Israel. Mr. Dimshitz checked his watch, and he told me, what? They started already the boarding? It's too early, you know. The boarding, like, I don't remember exactly the time, but like the boarding had to start 9 o'clock, and it was only 8:30. He told me, why they started it that early? I don't like it. I answered him, I just yelled at him, stop it, you know, it's not a Russian army. You know, you are used to a Russian army, everything is strict. It's not the army. Things change. So he hesitated for a while, and then he told me, okay, I'm taking my belongings, I'm packing, run back to the friends, tell them that I am joining the group. So I start running back, you know, as I was explaining, as I was excited before that, but now I was twice as much excited. I saved the operation. I make the real decision. So when I come back, entering the gate of the airport field, I was beaten, thrown on the ground, my hands handcuffed, and lying already with my nose on the baton of the airfield. I understood that it's it. It is what we expected. We arrested. So I was lifted. I was surrounded with some people, plainclothes again with guns, and my glasses fall down, but I still could see my friends that for the time being, when I ran back to see Mr. Dimshitz, they reached the airplane and all of them were arrested. So when I looked at it, it was not that exciting, and then I heard shootings, like boom, boom. I turned around, they shot at Mr. Dimshitz. He came blooding, a lot of blood on his face. His wife was excited. He cried, she yelled, and two small daughters altogether lost.
Он был фактически газ песком в область виска. Я отдернул голову, но кожа...
In fact, it was gas mixed with sand. They aimed at the forehead. I moved my head. The sand apparently had wounded the skin and blood dripped on the face. It certainly made a bad impression on my children and especially on my wife. In any case, I did not hear any more shots. They shot, in my opinion, only once.
But it was not that time to think about anything. Each of us was taken immediately to interrogation. I was pushed to a small room with 2 colonels of KGB, and the whole airport, or the building of the airport, was full with high-ranked KGB officers. So I understood finally that it was a trap. When being pushed to this small room, one of the colonels took a piece of sheet of a paper. It was the order of the local attorney to arrest me, and this order would read like that: under our information, a group of Jewish terrorists is acting in territory of this Smolny airport, trying to harm state security and to betray their Russian motherland, running away to an imperialistic state, not mentioning Israel. So the prosecutor general of this district would tell that I ordered to arrest them, to question them, and to warn them that it is true they expect death penalty. Too bad, you know. I was not that ready to. I was ready to die, but I figured that they will just kill us during the battle in the airport, or maybe when we come up in the air, we're shot with a rocket. But now I thought to myself, I have to stay during the interrogation, and who knows what kind of interrogation do they have in a KGB. And then, after interrogation, they will have a trial, and then, if they rule death sentence, I have to sit and expect being taken to be executed. It's not for me. I can do it. You know, you need to be a hero to do that. But they never asked me. I had no way. I had to be a hero. And then the colonel told me, sign it. I told, you changed my hands. How can I sign this way? So lose his hands. It was really not bracelets. It was simply ropes. So they lose the ropes. I shake the hands to get some blood in my hands. And I told, no, I'm not going to sign anything. Everything is mine. So tied it again. Make him feel that he's in our hands. Then they took me, each of us, in this specific black Volga cars to KGB headquarters in Leningrad. On the way, I could see people walking in the streets. It was morning, June 15, summer, beautiful time. And Leningrad by itself is a beautiful city. Old buildings from 18th century, 19th century, people, young people going, students, it was life. And I lost my life. So I asked myself, do you regret? Maybe it was a mistake. I thought for a while. And I told to myself, no, I don't regret. I am proud that I was part of it. And it was really an achievement to do something, a small man like me, for the freedom of my nation.
Here is what the government newspaper Izvestia wrote. There are also people in the West who are trying to present this sinful act as an innocent attempt by 11 people to leave their state. However, there is nothing in common between the wish to leave their motherland and establishing an armed band which planned in detail how to fall with arms on citizens. Dimshitz and his colleagues were sentenced according to their criminal acts. They planned to commit a very serious crime, an attack on the crew of a civilian airplane. The investigation continued for half a year. The verdict was given on December 15th.
Interrogations began. They frequently called the interrogator. I spoke to them very frankly, just as I am telling you now. I told them, for a long time I had wanted to leave the Soviet Union.
Понятно, что позиция наша сохраняет как бы непричастность поначалу к
It is clear that our version claiming that we had not wanted to hijack the plane did not hold up for long. In fact, we all admitted this. We denied that we intended to commit a crime of treason.
То есть это выставлялось под соусом бытовой побег с тем, чтобы
We presented the act as an innocent attempt to get to Israel so that we could live in the state of Israel.
Dimschitz's statement in the court made a big impression. It was clear that he had prepared it well. Dimschitz accused the Soviet authorities of anti-Semitism. He said, even the support of the Arab states by the Soviet Union comes not on account of political considerations, but purely for anti-Semitic reasons. You hate everything Jewish. Now, when we have our own state, you wish to destroy it. The judge was furious. He screamed, "Liar! Shut up!" Edward Kuznetsov criticized the Soviet regime. The judge asked Mendelevich, "Why did you wish to betray your motherland?" Mendelevich answered, "Although I was born here, it is not my motherland. The Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gave Eretz Israel to our forefathers and their descendants. Therefore that is my motherland." The prosecutor stood up. "You put a question to Mendelevich in vain. Didn't you know that he is a religious fanatic? It is inconceivable how someone with a university education can be so limited in his general outlook. Apart from his religion and his nation, he has nothing." He wished to hint to the judge that for this reason Mendelevich should receive a severe punishment. All the company behaved during the trial very respectfully and with national pride.
Каждый сказал в последнем слове, что он думает.
Everyone said in the summary what was in his heart. Dimschitz said that he was well aware that he had the good fortune to be with wonderful people like us, who during interrogation and trial, each one sought to back up his comrade and not to accuse each other.
И пришел черед говорить Сильве Залмансон.
When it was Silva Zalmanson's turn to speak, she stood up and said, "The accusations that we ate the bread of the Russian people and that we are scum are completely unfounded." And then she said in Hebrew, "Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yamini," and translated this into Russian. And there was complete silence in the courtroom.
Mark Dimschitz and Edward Kuznetsov were sentenced to death. After them, Yosef Mendelevich received the severest punishment, 15 years imprisonment for treason, attempting to hijack a plane, and for promoting Jewish education in the underground. The human rights activist and Nobel Prize winner Andrei Sakharov expressed his view about the Leningrad trial. There is no doubt that here was a case of adventurousness and infringement of the law, and for this they should rightfully be punished. At the same time, the crimes that they intended to commit did not endanger the lives of the pilots. The only passengers on board were members of the group. The hijacking of the plane was supposed to take place on the ground. In short, this was not a classic case of hijacking a plane, and without any doubt. The Nobel Prize winner and prominent scientist, Andrei Sakharov, gave an exact description of the Leningrad trial, but above all, he tried to extend a helping hand to the prisoners. Here are the recollections of Eva Lizitsyn, of blessed memory, the sister of Yosef Mendelevich. She succeeded in evading the KGB people and getting to Moscow in order to present an appeal to the Supreme Court.
I entered the Supreme Court. Present were Helen Bonner and also the mother and wife of Fedorov. A tall man approached us dressed in a gray suit. He looked very neglected. On his suit there were gold emblems of heroes of the Soviet Union. He had hung them in disorder out of contempt. He told me thus, "I am with you, heart and soul. I shall do all that I can to save the situation."
The Leningrad trial turned out to be a grave mistake on the part of the Soviet authorities. It exemplified to world opinion and world Jewry, in particular, the true situation of Soviet Jewry. In a declaration made by Yosef Mendelevich, in the name of the participants of the operation, he wrote, "Jews of the world, to you there has fallen the duty of the struggle for the freedom of your brethren in the Soviet Union. You should know that our fate to live and to exist depends upon you. These words echoed with incredible force. Throughout the world, there arose powerful movements for the release of the Soviet Jews. Demonstrations, media, diplomatic and political lobbies acted with amazing synchronization in order to achieve this sublime goal. Death sentences were abolished and all the sentences were reduced. The international pressure exerted on the Soviet Union led to the collapse of the Soviet regime. The gates of emigration opened.
После декабря 70-го года, когда был оглашен свирепый приговор.
In December 1970, the severe sentences were published for the imprisoned group, including the death and life sentences. This led to an outburst of demonstrations of identification and support in the West. And when this became known in the Soviet Union, this led to the identification of Soviet Jewry. Then it became clear that the subject of freedom, of emigration, the authorities were unable to silence.
Тему эту снять с повестки дня и внутри советской, и международной властям не удалось, и пришлось им со скрежетом зубовным пойти на...
Quite against their wishes, they had no option but to retreat, perhaps for the first time in the history of the Soviets, and to open the gates of emigration.
The Jewish people in the Soviet exile, for whom the Soviets had decreed extermination, came back to life. The enemies fell, and we arose and were comforted. Until the Soviet Union was disassembled, more than 500,000 people left the USSR. Prisoners of Zion were imprisoned in the Soviet Union for many years, but in the end, they also arrived in Israel. The last of them, Yosef Mendelevich, was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1981.